Then give us enough to where we can enjoy it. Don't just spit on us, that kind of thing. And now I'm about ready to say, please spit on us. Give us just enough so I don't have to shovel. Give us just enough so it doesn't cause me not to be able to do the things that we know we need to do. The fact is, things like the weather are going to happen. It's a part of the world that we live in, good things, bad things, and everything in between. It's just a part of living in this world. And by the way, there are some people who rejoice over the snow. Not all of us are as frustrated as most of us are. There are some that rejoice over it. Consider the kids who have been out of school and have gotten to enjoy it over these past 3 months, as it seems as though it snowed almost every 3 days. They're not going to enjoy it come summertime, but I'm sure they have enjoyed the break that they've gotten for much of this winter. We're going to be this morning looking in Genesis 39. We're going to continue to look through the story of Joseph. If you remember last week, I actually started us out on a series that's entitled The Home Run Life. And this series is primarily focusing on 4 things that need to be present in the life of every believer. You cannot just pick and choose which ones you want, because what happens is each one sort of builds off the other. And when you choose to leave something out, we run into a problem. In order to illustrate it this morning, just to kind of start out, I want to tell you about something that happened this week. There is a friend of mine who made a poor choice. I will not give his name. A part of the reason I will not give his name is because he is local. Actually, he got caught making a poor choice. A lot of us make poor choices often. Rarely do we actually get caught making those poor choices. Well, over the years, this individual has been a somewhat successful businessman. But success doesn't mean fulfillment. And this is a man who has built some great relationships. And I know that he's gone out of the way to, at least on many occasions, to develop the relationship between myself and even with my family and him. But even great relationships don't mean fulfillment. If you remember the chart, actually, I lost my person in the sound booth to actually click the down button. But you have 4 bases, and each one of the bases represents something different. The first one being home plate, and that is dependent. Specifically being dependent on God. It is our foundation when God is the very beginning and the end of everything. He is the source of every hope, every dream, every vision that we have, but He is also the one who equips us to do what we need to in the area of character, which is at first base, something that sometimes gets left out. I don't want to talk about it too much, because that's what my sermon is about in just a moment. And then you have second base, which is our relationships, where we really begin to develop those relationships with other people, and to even be able to work within those relationships. And then, of course, third base was where we talked about success, all of which should bring us back to the source, God, to begin with, because He's the one who makes us complete. Well, what often happens is sometimes we might experience those great relationships. Sometimes we might experience success, but then we forget to do certain other things. That would be my friend. Apparently, he found himself in an adulterous relationship. When the other woman's ex-husband found out, he fired more than 20 shots at my friend, putting 8 into him. Today, he remains in critical condition in a local hospital. As a mutual friend shared what happened, there were several thoughts that went through my mind. First, I imagined my friend's wife, who found out that her husband was having an affair. How devastated she must be, likely weeping over his betrayal, but also weeping over the possibility that he might die. But then my mind also raced to his eternal condition. I don't know whether or not he's a child of God. I know that the choices he was making certainly did not reflect someone who is living in a right relationship with Jesus Christ, and therefore I am concerned with his faith. Because of that, I pray for him every day since I found out, because I am concerned about whether he would die and spend eternity in hell. My mind also raced to this week's sermon. You see, there are many things that are important as we make our way around the bases. And if we choose to leave out any one thing, then we will be defeated. And of course, what's the one thing so many people tend to forget? It is the importance of good moral character and integrity. Character can be a struggle for many people, especially when we depend on our own strength to achieve that character. If you'll remember last week, we talked about the importance of establishing that strong foundation in Jesus Christ. He is the one who really equips us to do everything else. He's the one who gives the dream, our purpose for living. And everything else that we do is built upon His purpose, His vision for our lives. Why do we live lives that are filled with character? It's because Jesus Christ is a part of us. Not just a ride along, but He is the one who is driving, and we're following. Now, it was pointed out to me last week that some people may not be big baseball fans. So some of the terminology that I'm using and some of the things that I'm describing to you might be going over some of your heads. So I want to just kind of give you a couple of the basics real quick. There are certain things that all of us need to know. First of all, in order to win the game, you simply need to score more runs than the other team. It doesn't matter how many hits you may have. I've actually seen games where the winning team might have only had 2 or 3 hits, but they scored more runs than the other team. It's not about how many hits you get in the game. It's about how many times you score in the game. And how do you score? Pretty simple. You run across home plate. But of course, in order to get to home plate, you also must cross each of the other bases in order. You run from home to first, from second to third, home to first, first to second, second to third, and then third back to home. You can't just decide, well, you know what, I really like second base more than I like first base. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to run from home to second base. You're not allowed to. You're out of the baseline. You're automatically out. Let's say you're running along and you decide, you know what, I don't think I really have to touch first base. I just got close enough to it, that should count. Actually, no, it doesn't. If you do not touch the base, you can be called out even after the play is over. The point is, you cannot skip bases, no matter what. And if you do, you're not supposed to get out the score. You have to touch all of the bases, and you have to do it in order. As I shared earlier, I believe that many of us at times have attempted to skip a base here or there. And unfortunately, the base that is most often skipped is first base. It certainly would fit with my friend, but you cannot win if you skip any base. We've been looking at the biblical story of the Old Testament Joseph. It's in Genesis chapter 39 today. As you remember from last week, we started in chapter 37. We kind of skipped around a little bit. Most of what we're going to look at today is in Genesis 39, so I did not put the actual verses on the screen behind me. Part of the reason is you ought to know how to find the book of Genesis in your Bible by now. So if you're not already there, turn to Genesis chapter 39. And we're going to be looking in just a moment at verses 1 through 7. And then we'll look at verses 8 through 10 and then 11 and 12 a little bit afterwards. While you turn there, let me recap a couple things for you. First, in chapter 39, we find Joseph in the second major setting or the major scene of Joseph's life. In Act 1, Joseph is a spoiled young man, the favorite son of his father Israel, also named Jacob. But it's not just the favor of his father that makes him stand out. He also has the favor of God. In fact, God has given him a vision of things that are to come, and man, is it good. The people in his life, the people who are important to him, are one day going to bow down in front of him. Sounds like a great blessing. But you also know that not everybody would appreciate hearing that one day they're going to bow down to you. Act 1 comes to a violent conclusion as his brothers are fed up with their spoiled sibling. Not only does their father love him more, but now his arrogance is claiming that one day we will bow before him. So they fake his death and instead sell him into slavery to a band of traders that are heading for Egypt. They're actually Ishmaelites, individuals who typically would go to Egypt to trade with whatever they could come up with. As far as his father knows, Joseph is dead. As far as his brothers know, they'll never have to see him again. And to Joseph, he was given a vision of the future, but it would seem that that vision just hit a serious roadblock. Let me tell you something before we read the passage. I need you to understand that until this point, Joseph's character had never really been tested. He had been spoiled. He'd been given everything that he ever wanted. He never had to stress really over anything. He was loved in a way that his brothers only dreamed about. He had everything that he ever could have wanted. It's not to say that he didn't have great character prior to this, but it's never been quite as evident as it will be in today's passage. Consider that he accurately felt betrayed by his family. He may have even felt betrayed by his God. God, how could you let this happen to me? You promised blessing, yet here I am, a slave in Egypt. By the way, I think many of us probably have similar thoughts at some point. God, how could you let this happen? Because we got kind of worked out in our mind as to how God's going to make everything happen. It's going to fit perfect with the way we want it. But God had not betrayed him. Instead, God was preparing him for something significant and amazing. Let's look at the story beginning in verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household, and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Now the natural way to look at this story is to suggest that somehow Joseph's experience as a slave wasn't really that bad. And I can sort of get that to a point. I mean, he becomes somebody else's slave, but he's got a job in a nice house of a very wealthy master. He's actually put in a position where he's in charge of everything else. It was probably sort of like vacation. Well, the truth is, there's a big difference from being free and being a slave. And I don't care how good it was in Potiphar's house, he still longed to be back where he had been before. It wasn't the same. Probably longed to see his father. I'm not sure if he longed to see his brothers, but he probably longed to see his father. And this wasn't a cakewalk for him. When he first enters into the house of Potiphar, he was probably tasked with doing things that he had never had to do in his life. Remember, as a young man, he was spoiled. His brothers did all the work, and he was the one who they pretty much worked for. He comes into Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's going to expect him to get down and scrub the floors. He's going to expect him to take care of house duties that he's never had to deal with before. This was not some nice, easy job for him, but rather this was a time of struggle for him. Consider the fact that this is a man who is not only being asked to do things that he's never been able to do before, or never had to do before. This is also a man who probably felt broken as he entered in. He's been hated and betrayed by his family. He's all alone in a new environment. It's likely that he didn't even speak the Egyptian language. We kind of gather that because later on when his brothers will actually come to town, Joseph speaks to them through a translator. Because his brothers didn't speak the Egyptian language either. Which means that when he comes, he feels completely isolated. He doesn't even know how to talk to the people that are there. They point and they expect him to do. And that's all that he has. As a slave, he would have little hope of ever having a meaningful life. If anything, he would work to make another man successful. And who would ever want to marry such a man? To make matters worse, he is a young man, likely in his late teens when he enters into service at Potiphar's house. Now, I know that they live much longer than what people do today, but it's unlikely that he was physically much different from young men of today. What do I mean by that? His hormones would have been going crazy. Verse 7 tells us that he was a handsome, well-built, he was a good-looking man. And it didn't take long for Potiphar's wife to take notice of him. We never really see a description of Potiphar's wife. It doesn't really say a whole lot about her, except she is Potiphar's wife. But most historians would agree that she would likely have been incredibly beautiful. The idea is that she was probably some sort of trophy wife. He was a great man of importance in Pharaoh's kingdom. A man with such power would likely have attracted a very, very beautiful woman. Yet his work responsibilities would have likely kept him preoccupied. That means that he likely was unable to show her the affection that she longed for. Another possibility is that she sought Potiphar for his power and prestige, only to find out down the road that it wasn't enough. There was still something that was missing. Either way, you likely have a very well-built young man being pursued by a beautiful woman. And it would have been very easy for him to simply say yes. Remember, he's somewhat broken. He's a man who has experienced great rejection and betrayal, even defeat, feeling as though there is no hope for tomorrow. It would have been easy to say yes. Perhaps he could justify in his mind how this was what he deserved. After all, he had unfairly suffered and been betrayed. Perhaps he could simply excuse this act of sexual immorality, blaming the lustful passions that God placed in him, or even blaming this adulterous woman who was standing before him. Maybe he could blame Potiphar for neglecting the woman. There are all kinds of excuses that Joseph could have used, but he used none of them. Look at his response in verse 8. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. In Joseph's response, we see at least two things that were very, very important to Joseph. First, he shows that he is very much indebted to his master, to Potiphar. He knows that he's got it pretty good. I mean, we just talked about it's not the same as being free, but there are a lot of slaves that wish they had a master like Potiphar. If you can't be free, you may as well be in this household. He knows that his master is not only a good man, but he is a man who trusts Joseph. He has released everything else in the household to him, so he knows that he's well trusted. And Joseph doesn't want to do anything that might jeopardize that trust. But then he gets to the real issue for Joseph. It's not just his respect or his trust for Potiphar. It's not just that he doesn't want Potiphar to lose that trust in him. In fact, Potiphar will lose his trust in Joseph later on, because Potiphar's wife is going to tell a lie. It's not as much about Potiphar. The real issue for Joseph is his concern for God. In fact, he poses the question, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? He knew that God would be displeased if he gave in to sexual temptation, and he didn't want that to happen. My first thought is, wow, that is a good man. And I would suggest to you very clearly that he was certainly a great man of character. But I need you to understand that his goodness was about much more than just making the decision not to have sex with this woman. You need to know that this man's character was in place long before Potiphar's wife ever approached him. He had already had his Joshua 24 moment where Joshua declared, "Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve." He had already decided which God he was going to serve. I'm not living for myself. I'm not living for my prosperity. God had given him a vision about the future, but that's not really what's in question here. So God didn't give him everything he wanted in the way that he wanted. It doesn't change the fact that I belong to him. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? This man's character was evident. He didn't wait for temptation to strike and then decide what he was going to do. Instead, he had already surrendered his life and will to the Lord. We need to do the same. It's not enough to simply determine that we're going to be good people. We need that moment of surrender, which brings us back to home plate. He is the foundation of everything that we have. You want to be a good person? That's great. You know what? There are a lot of good people in this world. There are people who have good character. But without the foundation of Jesus Christ, that goodness will never, ever be enough. But when we have Jesus Christ as our true foundation, a natural byproduct ought to be a character that reflects His Spirit's presence in us. I know that we're all imperfect people. I know that there were struggles in every one of our lives. I will guarantee you, in Joseph's life, there were struggles. I told you that he was a young man filled with crazy hormones that were bringing all kinds of ideas into his mind. This woman was likely an incredibly beautiful woman, and he could probably justify in his mind why it would be okay. But in spite of the fact that the temptations and the thoughts were there, he knew he belonged to God. He already had his moment of surrender. And we need to have that same moment of surrender for us. When we fully depend on God, we establish a foundation that equips us to have that godly character like Joseph had. Now it's important to note that not everybody will support your choice to honor God. Potiphar's wife certainly did not support Joseph's choice. In fact, verse 10 tells us that she pursued him day after day. For Joseph, this was more than a one-time choice. He would have to choose daily to say no to this woman. He continually, every day, she would find an opportunity to try to get him alone, where it was just the two of them, where she could say something that might sort of draw him in. She didn't really support the fact that he wanted to honor God. Well, you know what? There are going to be a lot of people you're going to have to deal with that too. Not everybody's going to honor the fact that you want to live for God and you want to live to a higher standard. But it doesn't change the fact that we must live to that standard. I'm reminded of Nancy Reagan's push to fight drug abuse many years ago. Her theme was, just say no. This was a naive approach to overcoming an addiction that was still catching America by surprise. But the foundational principle is actually pretty good. Just say no. Don't do it. But you can't just make the choice one time. You have to make the choice every time. And without Christ as the foundational influence in your life, you will likely not have the strength to say no every time. Let me close with one last thing. The passage goes on to describe the final encounter between Joseph and Potiphar's wife. One day, as he served in the house, there were no other servants around, and she decided to turn up the heat a little bit. Look at verses 11 and 12 with me. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. One of the mistakes that many people make when it comes to temptation is that we often would rather play with sin instead of running from it. We know that it's bad news. We kind of like the way it feels. We kind of enjoy its closeness. It's kind of like when you go to the swimming pool. My kids by nature will run often around the edges of the pool. And almost inevitably you'll hear that whistle and someone yelling, walk, don't run. Well, when it comes to us, it ought to be completely the opposite. Run, don't walk. When you see that temptation approaching, and you realize that this is something that could be a stumbling block in my life, don't sit there and just, no big deal, just walk away. You need to turn and run as fast as you can. Get away from it. We have absolutely no business playing with it. I used a passage several weeks ago that I'd like to remind you of regarding this issue. It comes from 1 Thessalonians 5:22. In the King James Version it says, abstain from all appearance of evil. What that means is we're not just talking about the thing that is blatantly sinful, but those things that you look at and you think, well, it's not really sin. It may be compromise. I guess it's okay because it's not as bad as other things. Abstain from even the appearance of evil. If you're just looking for the big things, trying to justify why it's okay that I sin because it's not really as bad as other sins, you missed that whole verse. Abstain from even the appearance of evil. You say, well, I spent the night at my girlfriend's house, but we didn't really do anything. Oh. What appearance arises out of that? Does it look like you did more? Absolutely. I spent the night hanging out in the bar, and I didn't drink anything, but I know I've had a struggle with alcohol, but I was good the whole night. Really? What appearance comes from that? My pastor in Colorado has an issue with his heart. Family history of heart disease, and doctor prescribed him to drink a glass of wine every night with his meal. He was so afraid to go to get a bottle of wine. Actually, he had one of the other guys from the church who would go get it for him. Not sure that actually is a healthy thing either, but the point was this. He didn't even want to give off the appearance of evil. So he would rather just completely stay away from it. I think we as the body of Christ need to be a little more intentional about even avoiding the appearance of evil. If you know that it's a compromise, you're too close to it. Don't walk away from it. Turn and run. Joseph understood that. By the way, his character would show through many, many times into the future. Consider the fact that when his brothers come later on, he shows great character and grace to them. Instead of having them executed, he loves them, he embraces them, he actually gives them a reward. He invites them to come back, to settle in the land of Egypt. He blesses them. It's the same guys that tried to sell him into slavery. They did sell him into slavery. They wanted him to die. Talk about character. Wow. Your character is going to show up in many different ways. And I assure you this. If you lack that character at some point, that lack of character will get in the way of everything else that you do. It may show up in your relationships. Your lack of character may hurt a relationship. It may destroy a relationship. It may break trust. But it's going to show up. That success, how many of us have seen individuals who are on that high-speed route to success, where it looked like everything was falling into place, and somewhere along the way, their character got in the way? For me, I've seen it with pastors. Unfortunately, many of the pastors that have served alongside me are no longer in ministry today. Because although they were good at what they did, they lacked the character that God required of them. I've seen it in husbands. I've seen it in fathers, seen it in wives. The character will eventually get in the way, and it will keep you from doing what God desires for you. My challenge to you today is to examine your